So when I was looking at the reports on erythritol and, these headlines that are just eliciting so much fear about erythritol and heart disease, one of the things that stood out to me and didn't make sense was that the blood that was collected for many of these preliminary studies was taken in the early 2000s and then analyzed over the years to see the correlation with heart disease. Well, in the early 2000s, that was way before erythritol was widely used as an ingredient as a plant-based sweetener. So right away, my first thought was it doesn't make sense that consumption of a plant-based sweetener like this is causing these results.
Yay Networks.
A quick note before we dive into today's podcast. If you like what you hear, I would love for you to subscribe to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, wherever you download your podcast. It would also be incredible if you take a minute to rate and review this podcast. Those things do matter and they really help us. If you are a regular listener of this podcast, you know that I am, pretty straightforward. I want to help guide our listeners in discerning what's really important, what really matters, where to put our energy, our focus, our efforts, and what can we let go of. I don't love it when there's a level of hysteria on things, especially when it's unwarranted. And that's kind of what's happening right now this week. I can't tell you how many people have reached out to me. There was a study this week that just got a ton of press, tons of media about erythritol, a plant-based natural sweetener linked to heart attack and stroke, and the panic that has ensued. So in this week's episode, we're going to take a deeper dive, look at what that study really found, and really sort through what those headlines are saying. So one of the things that initially caught my eye the second I was reading through that first report that I saw was that the window of blood collection was in the early 2000s. And Truvia, which is one of the first big products that had erythritol or has erythritol in it, Truvia didn't hit the market until like 2009, 2010, and it really wasn't widespread right away. Swerve hit the market maybe 2011, 12. So the window of blood collection that showed these high levels of erythritol linking to increased risk of these major adverse effects was before erythritol was even really widespread in the food supply. Like it wasn't really being used as an ingredient in Halo Top or any of these other things like we see. So something that I didn't realize, and this was something new that I learned about erythritol. Erythritol being that plant-based sweetener, it occurs naturally in plants. It's also produced commercially through fermentation to create that plant-based sweetener. Like I said, it's about 70% as sweet as sugar. Erythritol is also produced in our bodies. And I guess I didn't have a reason to explore this. And so what I didn't know is that erythritol is produced in our bodies naturally. And it tends to be produced in higher amounts when we have higher blood glucose levels and higher levels of oxidative stress. So things like high glucose levels and high levels of oxidative stress, those are risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And so the high glucose levels, high stress levels, high oxidative stress levels causes our body to produce more erythritol. So we'll take a step back and we'll look at, okay, what is erythritol? So I mentioned it's in some of these sweeteners that you'll see in Truvia and Swerve. You'll also see it in a lot of beverages, something like a vitamin water zero, the drink by BAI. It's in ice creams like Halo Top. So you'll see it used as a plant-based sweetener in products like that. Also, full disclosure, Swerve, which is one of the erythritol-based products, Swerve sponsored my WGNO segment up until, I guess, about 2 years ago. And so I'm very familiar with their product and I like their product. I like the way that it works, it functions. And we have used that ingredient in our cookbook, the Eat Fit cookbook, also in some of our drinks in our newest book. So full disclosure there. So I was especially alarmed also when I saw the headlines. I'm like, do we need to, work on reformulating different recipes that we're using that include this ingredient. Like, how much do we need to worry? So when we start really looking at, okay, what did this study truly show? On first glance, if you again continue reading the article, the CNN article, the overarching kind of messaging is that people with existing risk factors for heart disease, like diabetes, were twice as likely to experience a heart attack or stroke when they had the highest levels of erythritol circulating in their blood. So immediately we think, oh, wow, if I'm going to consume the sweetener erythritol, it's increasing my risk for heart disease. I'm going to link in the episode notes to a few experts who have broken this down in really easy to understand fashion. One is Dr. Nicola Guess. She is a registered dietitian and PhD based in the UK. And I really liked how she just very clearly, very concisely explains it. And really, her first take is, let's look at the study with a high level of caution. She also points out that the actual manuscript didn't include the actual outcome data, which is unusual for a paper like this. So when we look at this, okay, the paper and the reports say there's a strong association between blood levels of erythritol and these major adverse cardiovascular events. And that sounds very scary. Here's the thing that I think is really important to understand, though. Blood levels of erythritol are a marker for heart disease. They've been a marker and an indicator for someone's risk of heart disease. That doesn't mean, though, that erythritol is the cause of that heart disease. So simply because the blood levels of erythritol are high and they are known to be an indicator or a risk factor for heart disease, I'll say it a second time, that doesn't mean that erythritol is the cause of this heart disease. And in fact, it can be just as likely that it's the reverse, that someone who is at an increased risk for cardiovascular disease has elevated erythritol levels. So I'll say it a few different ways. And, as Dr. Guest and other researchers are looking at the data, the general consensus is that it's unlikely that erythritol from our food supply is causing these associations with heart disease and increased risk factors for heart disease. Instead, realizing that our plasma, our blood levels of erythritol are instead reflecting high glucose levels, high circulating blood sugar levels, and or a high glucose diet. Or like we said, inflammation or the oxidative stress. So those things in themselves are the risk factors. High circulating glucose levels, high sugar diet, high levels of oxidative stress, inflammation. These are the things that trigger a greater production of erythritol. So again, just thinking of it that, yes, we're seeing that association. That doesn't mean it's a cause. It doesn't mean that erythritol is causing it. So one of the researchers also pointed out that, yes, the elevated erythritols are likely a consequence of poor health, but not a cause, and which is actually the reverse of what those headlines are indicating to us. Let's take a minute to share about Caraway Home, our partner for this week's episode. Caraway Home's non-toxic kitchenware collections make cooking and baking a piece of cake. We love our cookware. It's our go-to for everything from seared salmon to creamy spinach to our Eat Fit candied cashews. The pans heat up quickly, they cook evenly, and they're incredibly easy to clean. With our exclusive discount, you can now save on the full suite of Caraway products, including their internet famous non-toxic cookware set, also Caraway's food storage, tea kettle, and mini cookware. Visit carawayhome.com/fueled to take advantage of this limited time offer for 10% off your next purchase. This deal is exclusive for our listeners, so visit carawayhome.com/fueled or use promo code FUELED at checkout. Caraway, non-toxic cookware made modern. Now, does that mean that we're guaranteed and everything is in the clear? Of course, the takeaway message is almost always going to be that more research is needed. And in this case, we would say, yes, more research is needed. I'm going to link to a great article in the New York Times. The headline of that, I'll say, was Study suggests possible link between sugar substitute and heart issues. Experts say don't panic. So I liked that that was the headline there. There is that possible link. They don't get as much into the explanation of how erythritol is produced in the body and that some of these things that are also risk factors for heart disease can increase our body's production essentially of erythritol. But instead, they do go more into a little bit more of a conversation about erythritol and its potential benefits, and that it can be incredibly helpful in people in limiting their sugar intake, because we also know that, again, that high sugar intake is a risk factor for heart disease. It can help with people controlling their glucose levels, controlling diabetes, type 2 diabetes. So the New York Times article addresses some of those key points in the study, but then also really looks at what some of the key limitations were for the study. And so, as they point out, the majority of the participants had either cardiovascular disease or multiple risk factors for cardiovascular disease, which could potentially skew the data. And again, as they say, while it found that association between erythritol and elevated risk, it didn't show or prove that erythritol is what's causing the strokes and heart attacks. So again, always, always more research is needed. And one of the experts interviewed for this New York Times piece, Dr. Joanne Slavin, she's a professor of food science and nutrition at the University of Minnesota. One of the things that she points out is that people who consume high amounts of artificial sweeteners or these natural plant-based sweeteners, if they're actively seeking out foods sweetened with products like erythritol or other types of low-calorie sweeteners, it's likely that the people who are consuming a lot of these sweeteners may already be at risk for cardiovascular issues, and that's why they're seeking out these lower sugar products. So if they have a condition like diabetes or obesity, they may be using these low calorie sweeteners to try to dial back on sugar. So she really emphasizes that that's the important thing, is for people not to say, hey, this plant-based sweetener is terrible, it's giving us heart attacks, but instead saying, okay, hey, this is another data point. Let's look into this a little bit more. And also realizing that the plant-based sweeteners and sugar replacers like erythritol and others, in the same types of categories, they can be that important tool for people who are trying to lower the amount of added sugars they're consuming. So on social media, I saw, some people say, well, why do you need to use this anyway? Why wouldn't you use stevia or monk fruit instead? And they all function so differently. And something like erythritol really functions very similarly to sugar. It has the bulk closer to sugar. It bakes in a way more like sugar does than something like monk fruit or stevia. So while monk fruit or stevia may work well in someone's coffee or tea or something like that, the erythritol is usually added to those sweeteners to add that bulk so that it does function more like sugar, sweetens more in the ratio of sugar, adds that moisture, all the other things that sugar do. So it isn't just as simple as saying, well, if someone's, let's say, having erythritol, we'll just switch to monk fruit or stevia. They do function in a very different way. So if someone's been using something and they're using it on the regular, or they're having, like we said, the ice cream or Halo Top or whatever it is that's sweetened with this, and it's been working well for them nutritionally, then they are feeling kind of torn. Do you keep consuming these foods? How much fears should we have? So I'll say the takeaway from myself on this, also from other dietitians, and like I mentioned, the dietitians and PhDs, I'll link to some of their websites, also their social accounts. I think that they have interesting conversation on there as well. And it's one of those things where bad news travels fast or scary news travels fast. There was actually just recently another really in-depth review of erythritol that was published earlier this year, and still in 2023, that really broke down erythritol in a very objective way. And so if you want to know more about it, I'm also going to link to that. But, it talks about the how it's produced commercially for fermentation to be used as a natural plant-based sweetener in foods. As we said, it's at 70%-ish, about as sweet as sugar. So it works well in a lot of applications in a very similar approach of how we would use sugar. This review also goes into a lot of depth about how erythritol, we can consume erythritol in foods, but it's also naturally produced by our bodies. And so it is a very just straightforward approach of how our bodies produce erythritol, just naturally, and also what can increase the production of erythritol inside of our body. It covers erythritol safety. There's been studies from 2000, 2001, and on since that are showing and indicating the safety of erythritol. Always, again, we would say that more research can be done, and more research is always going to be beneficial. And you can see a summary and links to much of that data in this one concise article. This paper also covers the potential or the benefits of erythritol on things like tooth health, minimizing tooth decay, also the benefits of erythritol on glucose levels and insulin resistance. Also, influence on weight, body composition, appetite. Also, it talks about blood levels of erythritol as a predictor of certain types of risk. And some of the things we talked about, cardiovascular risk factors, but also higher levels of glucose. So basically higher blood sugar levels, which isn't a good thing. Higher weight gain, which isn't a good thing. So these things that it says, oddly, interestingly, there's a few studies that are showing a positive association of our blood levels of erythritol with these things that aren't good for us. And so this article, again, which is just a very objective um, review that was published just before this other one, it's saying that it's important to note that while these associations, they seem contradictory because there's all these beneficial effects that are seen when someone especially replaces sugar with something like erythritol. So it's interesting that it's showing that high blood levels of erythritol are associated with these negative effects. And so really this article also kind of sums it up with what we said earlier, that a diet that's high in sugar, the high levels of obesity induced inflammation, all of these things are increasing our body's production of erythritol. And that can be one of the primary reasons we're seeing that correlation with erythritol in our blood levels and cardiovascular disease. So I'll link to these articles that we're talking about. I'll link to the studies that I'm referencing here. And I'll link to some of the researchers, especially Dr. Nicola Guess. I think I really like her very matter-of-fact approach of breaking down the science for us. And I think our big takeaway is, as we said, of course, more research is needed. Is it to say that, so many times, just I think what we do in the US is if a little is good, then a lot is going to be better. I have a podcast, an episode coming up in a couple of weeks on, diet drugs, prescription weight loss drugs. And Ozempic is one that, I was just having a conversation with someone today, and they have a shop, kind of and that has just a lot of people in the neighborhood coming and going. And they said, Molly, every person who's coming in practically, I think, tells me that they're on Ozempic. So if we have one thing that, Ozempic is a weight loss medication that, you know, is used for diabetes control. Oh, but it can help me lose weight. And then we go more, more, more. So more people are taking more for longer. So I think just so many times as a culture, of course, we have that mindset of if a little is fine, then more must be better. And so with anything, I would say, let's look at how much are we using? How much are we sweetening our foods with, whether it's erythritol or any type of sweetener, whether it is sugar or other plant-based sweeteners, or if someone is using artificial sweeteners, that how much of it are we using? And it kind of goes back to, well, how about we have our food really taste like our food? How much do we really need to have such sweet, sweet, sweet foods in the first place? And of course, there's going to be the opportunity that if we're baking cookies and we can use a lower sugar, natural plant-based sweetener instead of sugar, or we're using almond flour instead of white flour, we're going to kind of make these um, changes, especially if it's something that we kind of keep around and we have it on the regular. But how much of our diet and how much of our intake including these foods. Because if we're talking about what's truly nourishing and for our bodies, then the foods that we're going to look at are those real whole foods, the plants, the vegetables, the fruits, the lean proteins, the fish, the seafood, the omega-3 rich fish. There's so many other real whole foods that we want to be sure to fill our days with. And if we are looking at foods that are sweetened with the plant-based sweeteners, whether it's erythritol or others, then that also, y'all know I don't love the word should, but that really shouldn't make up the bulk of our diet anyway. So I think it's a good kind of level set. It's a little reality check to say, okay, let's assess just how much of these foods am I having anyway. If my breakfast is a protein bar, if my lunch is a protein drink that's sweetened with erythritol, if my nighttime snack after dinner is Halo Top that's sweetened with erythritol, how much of that is even just like real whole food in its natural state anyway? So I think it is just kind of a nice check for us to say, okay, instead of that, could I do just a square of 70+% dark chocolate? Could I do berries with Greek yogurt instead? Finding things that are that real whole food versus processed foods sweetened with erythritol or whatever else that plant-based sweetener may be. So I hope that this has helped to give a bit of clarity. I hope it hasn't muddied the waters even further for you. I think just our final note is realizing that because blood levels of a compound like erythritol are associated with an increased risk of heart disease, that doesn't mean it's what's causing that heart disease. It doesn't mean that that alone is the risk factor. And in the case of what we're looking at, our bodies produce erythritol. The blood samples, many of the blood samples used in these studies that were reported out on, those blood samples were taken before erythritol was even widely used as an ingredient in our foods. And so what we're seeing of those increased levels of erythritol that had that association, it wasn't from food in many of those. It was from our body's own production. And then when we understand that our body's production of erythritol tends to increase with high levels of glucose, high blood sugar levels, high intake of sugar, the high oxidative stress, high levels of inflammation, obesity-related inflammation, all of those things are contributing to that higher production of erythritol in our bodies. And that's why that could be that association. I'm sure this is not the last we're going to be talking of erythritol and these studies. There's going to be more and more coming out, I know. And whether it's just me doing a solo episode or I have one of the experts that I've been sharing with y'all joining me, I will continue to keep y'all up to date as much as I can as there's new things coming out that we feel warrants kind of sorting through the clutter and helping to make sense of what these headlines are and really focusing on what really matters. So as I mentioned, I'll include the links that we talked about in the show notes of this episode and let me know what you think. I know there's going to be a lot of confusion. There's going to be more questions. Always feel free to reach out. I am registered dietitian Molly Kimball, and you've been listening to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, the podcast. If you'd like more Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, please head over to mollykimball.com and you can follow me, Molly Kimball RD, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next week for another dose of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition. Thanks for listening and stay focused on living your strongest, healthiest life.